Railroading in New England has always been a difficult proposition. That's even more so today in the highly competitive transportation environment in the region, where interstate trucks vie and compete with rail lines for meager traffic pickings. There are 3 rail lines, though, that manage to survive in this very competitive environment, and that's what we're going to be talking about. The 3 are the Central Vermont, the Boston and Albany, or Conn and the Boston and Maine. The 3, as we said, are picking over a meager traffic base in an intense rivalry that's gone back 150 years. They're the rivals. Let's look at a map of New England's trunk lines today. We have the Boston and Maine and Boston and Albany, or Conn Rail, paralleling each other east-west from Boston to Rotterdam Junction, New York. North-south are the Conn River line of the Boston and Maine and the Central Vermont, which runs from New London, Connecticut to St. Albans via White River Junction. We'll look at the New York Central, which today is part of Conn Rail. This line runs between Boston, Mass. And Rotterdam Junction, New York, via Worcester and Springfield. Following our study of the Boston and Albany, we'll then look at the Boston and Maine's Hoosick Tunnel Route, or Fitchburg Division, running east to west from Boston, Mass. All the way to Rotterdam Junction, New York, via the famous Hoosick Tunnel. This line operates through some of northern Massachusetts' largest towns, including Gardner and Greenfield, Mass. We'll then proceed to study the north-south Conn River line of the Boston and Maine. This track is operated jointly by Central Vermont and B&M, and has been for over 100 years. It runs between Springfield, Mass. On the B&M to White River Junction, Vermont. Central Vermont joins in at East Northfield and runs jointly from there all the way to White River. White River Junction is where the Boston and Maine and Central Vermont part ways, CV heading up towards St. Albans, Vermont, and the B&M continuing north toward Newport. An important interchange point on the Conn River line in years gone by was Bellows Falls, Vermont. This is where the CV and B&M crossed the old Rutland. Today the Rutland's operated as the Green Mountain Railroad and is still an important connection. Because the Conn River served as such an important bridge line north to south, it saw units from many different railroads. Canadian National's long-time affiliation with Central Vermont brought with it some CN power. Boston and Maine for many years pooled power with the Canadian Pacific up and down the line. Occasionally, other motive power arrangements produced some unusual rash-ups on the Connecticut River Route, such as this one seen here at Claremont Junction. We'll begin our discussion with the east-west competition of the Boston and Albany, or Conrail today, and the Boston and Maine. The two railroads bear as many similarities as they do differences. Boston and Maine and Boston and Albany each had to cross the Berkshire Hills, but they did it in different ways, very different ways. The Boston and Maine chose the Hoosick Tunnel route. It took 25 years to build the tunnel, but it gave them what many people consider to be a decided advantage in grades. However, the Troy and Greenfield Railroad, which became the Boston and Maine, had many serpentine alignments, a very curvaceous track pattern going up to the tunnel. Boston and Albany, on the other hand, chose steeper grades, wider curves. It was engineered by Whistler, and depending on who you talk to, is probably the better of the two lines. We're going to start our discussion here at the summit of the Boston and Albany, in Washington Summit, Massachusetts. Conrail's Boston and Albany main line serves some of Massachusetts' largest cities, including Worcester, Springfield, and Pittsfield. We'll begin our look at the B&A main line in Worcester, Mass., and we'll work our way west from there. In addition to the day-to-day operations on the B&A main line, occasional extra trains are operated as well, such as this Mass Bay Railroad Enthusiast Excursion Extra. At the rear end, we see the private car Caritas. Although Springfield, Massachusetts is only a shadow of its former glory, it still serves as an important junction point with Conrail to Boston and Maine and Amtrak. Here we see an eastbound Conrail freight train heading toward Boston through Springfield Station. In the background awaits a southbound passenger train ready to head out toward Hartford, Connecticut and New Haven. Conrail has a tough haul over the Berkshire Hills in western Mass. Back in Boston Albany days, Chester, Mass. was a busy helper station. From here, many units were dispatched, pushing westbound trains up over the hill to Washington Summit. The west side of the Berkshire Hills has its steep grades as well, as witnessed here by this scene in Pittsfield. In addition to being Massachusetts' largest city west of the Connecticut River, Pittsfield, Mass. is also the home of a large General Electric Company manufacturing facility. Transformers are made here and shipped out on specially designed center-depressed flat cars, such as that which we see in this scene. Poking through a small ridge just west of the New York-Massachusetts border are the twin state line tunnels. These are the only tunnels on the Boston and Albany main line. Here we see an eastbound Conrail job working its way up to the eastbound tunnel. Here we have a westbound Mass Bay Railroad enthusiasts extra passenger train running through Chatham, New York. Chatham was at one time a connection with both the Rutland Railroad and New York Central's Harlem Division. Rotterdam Junction, New York, in addition to being an important byway on Conrail, is also the Boston Maine Railroad's western connection. In our next segment, we'll be talking about the Boston and Maine's east-west Fitchburg Division main line. This was originally the Fitchburg Railroad, founded in 1841, and it features the 4 3/4 mile long Hoosac Tunnel. It still serves as an important conduit for traffic coming from the state of Maine going west, as well as for raw materials coming into New England. We'll study the Fitchburg Division from west to east. In addition to the B&M's interchange with Conrail at Rotterdam Junction, New York, the railroad also interchanges with the Delaware and Hudson at Mechanicsville. Our first scene will open up at Alplos, New York, showing the B&M crossing over the D&H. Hoosick Tunnel in northwestern Massachusetts. It was here in the early part of the 19th century that engineer Loamy Baldwin first proposed a canal tunnel to ship goods from Boston to the western markets. That idea died in stillbirth, but later in the century, a businessman from Fitchburg, Mass., Alva Crocker, nurtured an idea that finally grew to become what we know today as the Hoosac Tunnel. Crocker's Troy and Greenfield Railroad was empowered with a charter by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to build the huge bore, 4.75 miles long. The tunnel project proved more than the little Troy and Greenfield could undertake, however. And Yankee ingenuity had definitely met its match. After nearly a quarter century of drilling, and digging, blasting, and political firestorms in Boston, the Hoosac Tunnel was finally completed by a Canadian engineering firm. It stands here today, 115 years later, as a monument to the tenacity and spirit that was Alva Crocker and the Troy and Greenfield Railroad. Each of the east-west lines in Massachusetts has their problems. The Boston Albany, of course, has its very steep grades. The B&M line, thanks to the Hoosick Tunnel, doesn't have to deal with that problem. However, it does have to deal with considerably sharper curves. Here's a scene at Charlemont, Mass. that pretty much typifies the serpentine alignment of the Boston and Maine west of Greenfield. At the junction of the B&M's east-west and north-south main lines is the East Deerfield Yard. In addition to being a major freight classification point, East Deerfield also has large engine servicing facilities, as well as car repair shops. Now that we've taken a look at the east-west competitions, let's switch over to the north-south between the central Vermont and Boston, Maine. The CV begins in New London, Connecticut. It proceeds north from there through Massachusetts, crossing the Boston and Albany at Palmer and the B&M at Miller's Falls. It joins in with the Boston and Maine's north-south Connecticut River main line from Springfield at East Northfield, Mass. From there, the two railroads run together to White River Junction, Vermont. At White River, the CV branches off toward the northwest to St. Albans and eventually to Montreal. The B&M main line heads just about due north to Newport, Vermont. We'll begin our north-south study at Springfield, Mass. On the B&M. From there, we'll head north to White River Junction, Vermont, and we'll turn on a wheel and head back down the CV toward New London, Connecticut. Servicing B&M's lines in Connecticut is symbol freight EDPL, operating out of East Deerfield to Plainville, Connecticut. Here, EDPL is heading south to Chicopee, Mass. We'll leave trackside for a moment now and hop in the cab of one of B&M's vintage Jeep 9s for a ride down the Conn River line. B&M's West End isn't the only part of the railroad with serpentine curves. Witness this shot of a southbound at Westminster, Vermont, negotiating some rather sharp curves on the Conn River line. The east-west lines have natural obstacles to overcome in that they have steep grades and sharp curves. However, in the case of the Conn River line, a man-made obstacle serves as the restricting feature. This is the Bellows Falls Tunnel in Bellows Falls, Vermont. It wasn't until 1977 that the floor of the tunnel was lowered enough to allow for the passage of tri-level auto racks. Here we see southbound B&M freight WJED operating between White River Junction, Vermont and East Deerfield, Mass. The High Bridge at West Claremont, New Hampshire, in addition to being the tallest in the Conn River Route, is also the tallest in the Boston and Maine. Let's talk about the CV now. Central Vermont's traffic primarily consists of cement, paper products, and lumber. Coming from Canada, it enters New England through St. Albans, Vermont, coming down into White River Junction, and then following south into Massachusetts and Connecticut. Regular Amtrak passenger service on the Conn River line was suspended in May 1987 due to deteriorating track conditions. Passengers were bused north of Springfield, Mass. All the way to Montreal. This condition existed for almost a year and a half. The ensuing court battle, which was finally settled in September of 1988, saw ownership of the section of track from East Northfield, Mass. To White River Junction, Vermont, go to the Central Vermont Railway. Central Vermont subsequently upgraded the main line to once again allow for the resumption of Amtrak passenger service. Here we see a multitude of CV track equipment working on grooming the main line in preparation for the reinstatement of Amtrak passenger service.
Mike, get that behind you.
This is Wachusett Reservoir in West Boylston, Mass. When we began this production in early 1990, the Boston and Maine and Conn Rail were each running their respective east-west traffic over their own main lines. However, Boston and Maine's western connection, the Delaware and Hudson, was put in receivership some time back. And as a result of that, because of the tenuous ongoing problems with the western connection and the interchange with Delaware and Hudson, Boston and Maine saw fit to divert much of its east-west traffic over the Conn Rail main line until the situation was resolved. Subsequently, we have traffic running over the B&A, then up the Worcester Route main line of the Boston and Maine to Ayer. At Ayer, it can then travel to points in eastern Massachusetts and down eastern Maine. No one knows how long this situation is going to go on for, but you can be sure of one thing. No matter what the outcome, the face of railroading in New England will never be the same again.